grave should have been empty, but graves in Wallachia never stay that way for long. In the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, where wolves howl prayers to indifferent gods and the wind carries the scent of old blood, a child draws his first breath in the winter of 1431. The world is bleeding. It has been bleeding for centuries, and it will bleed for centuries more. But this child, this small, dark-haired thing, screaming in a stone chamber while candles flicker like dying stars, this child will teach the world new ways to bleed. His name is Vlad, third of his line, son of the dragon. The dragon's seal hangs heavy around his father's neck, a medallion that catches firelight like trapped lightning. Vlad II Dracula. The dragon wears the mark of the order, sworn to Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund in a ceremony that promised to defend Christendom against the Islamic tide rising from the east. But promises, like dragons, are creatures of myth and necessity. They live only as long as they serve, and they die the moment survival demands their sacrifice. Wallachia sits like a wounded animal between the jaws of empires. To the north, Hungarian kings dream of crusades and count coins they don't possess. To the south, Ottoman sultans sharpen their scimitars on the bones of Byzantine emperors. To the east and west, other princes watch and wait, and calculate the precise moment when betrayal becomes wisdom. This is the world into which Vlad is born, a world where loyalty is a luxury, and survival is an art that demands constant practice. The dragon must learn to serve two masters. In 1444, when young Vlad is 13 and still believes his father's promises about honor and faith, the Treaty of Adrianople spreads its ink across parchment, like blood across stone. Vlad Dracul bows to Sultan Murad II, not from choice, but from the mathematical certainty that defiance equals death. The Christian crusade bleeds out on the beaches of Varna, its noble knights food for crows and cautionary tales. King Władysław III of Poland dies with Ottoman steel in his chest, his severed head displayed on a spear like a battle standard. The last great Christian army of the age dissolves into mud and memory. The dragon bends his neck to the Ottoman yoke, but the Turks understand that bent necks can straighten at inconvenient moments. They demand insurance. They demand flesh. Two sons, two boys who will live as hostages in Ottoman lands, their breathing bodies the guarantee of their father's continued submission. Vlad, dark-haired and 13, silent as winter stone. Radu, called the Fair for his golden beauty, younger by a year and already learning to smile when men look at him too long. The horses that carry them from their father's castle make no sound on the cobblestones. Even the beasts understand that some journeys are too terrible for noise. The fortress of Egrigos rises from the Anatolian earth like a fist closed around secrets. Here, behind walls that have never known mercy, the Ottoman court practices the art called devshirme, the blood tax that transforms Christian children into Islamic weapons. Some break like twigs in winter wind. Some bend like green branches, finding new shapes that help them survive. Some discover that pain, applied with sufficient skill and persistence, can forge them into something their enemies never expected. Young Vlad learns the weight of chains in his first week. The taste of his own blood becomes familiar as bread, as common as water. His Turkish captors speak to him in a language that sounds like knives being sharpened, and when he doesn't understand quickly enough, they teach him comprehension through methods that leave scars on his back and deeper wounds in places that have no names. But they also teach him other things: strategy, diplomacy, the way to read a man's intentions in the set of his shoulders, the flicker of his eyes, the spaces between his words. They teach him Turkish and Greek and Latin, languages that will serve him when he returns to a world where survival depends on knowing exactly what enemies are saying when they think you can't understand them. Most importantly, They teach him that power is not inherited like eye color or the shape of one's hands. Power is seized. Power is held. Power is the willingness to do what others cannot or will not do, no matter how much blood pools around your feet when the work is finished. Radu learns different lessons. Radu, beautiful as a Byzantine icon and quick to smile, discovers that submission has its own rewards. He learns Ottoman customs with the enthusiasm of a convert, speaks Turkish without his brother's harsh accent, catches the attention of Prince Mehmed, the Sultan's son who will one day conquer Constantinople and earn the name the Conqueror. Radu becomes beloved. Radu becomes protected. Radu learns to sleep peacefully in a bed that might have been Vlad's grave. Vlad watches his brother's transformation and files it away in the part of his mind where he stores all betrayals, all abandonments, all the small deaths that teach a man that he can trust no one. Not even the blood of his blood, the bone of his bone. The years pass like stones thrown into dark water. Each one sinks without sound, but the ripples spread wider with each impact. Vlad grows taller, broader, his child's softness hardening into edges that can cut the unwary. His Turkish captors begin to look at him differently, not as a hostage to be broken, but as a weapon to be wielded. They speak of sending him back to Wallachia eventually, of using his bloodline and his bitter education to secure Ottoman interests in the troublesome principality that squats between empires like a spider in its web. But weapons, even carefully forged weapons, sometimes cut the hands that wield them. News arrives in 1447, like a raven settling on carrion. Vlad Dracula is dead. The Hungarian-backed boyars, the noble families who have always resented the dragon's accommodation with the Turks, have taken their revenge with interest compounded over years of humiliation. They buried the old prince alive, along with his eldest son Mircea, forcing earth into mouths that still moved with curses and prayers. The dragon is dead, and his fire dies with him. But dragons, the stories say, sometimes have more than one head. Young Vlad receives this news in silence. He does not weep. He does not rage. He does not swear oaths or make promises or speak of justice or revenge. He simply nods, as if his father's death were a problem in mathematics that he has just solved, and returns to his studies with the focused attention of a student who has finally understood what subject he is truly being taught. The subject is power. The method is pain. The final examination will be written in blood, and Vlad intends to pass with the highest possible marks. The Ottomans decide it is time to send their carefully crafted weapon back to Wallachia. Not yet as ruler, he is still too young, still too obviously their creature, but as a presence, a reminder that the dragon's line continues under Turkish protection. They give him a small army, enough men to be dangerous, but not enough to be independent. They give him gold, enough to buy loyalty, but not enough to buy freedom. They give him their blessing, which is worth exactly as much as it costs. What they cannot give him, what no one can give him, is the one thing he has learned to value above all others: the knowledge that in a world of betrayals and broken promises, the only reliable constant is the willingness to make your enemies fear you more than they fear death itself. Vlad rides toward Wallachia in the spring of 1448, 17 years old and carrying scars both visible and hidden. Behind him, his brother Radu remains in the Ottoman court, safe and comfortable and lost. Ahead of him lies a principality ravaged by competing armies, ruled by boyars who killed his father, populated by peasants who have learned to bow to whoever happens to be passing through with the most swords. He does not yet know he will earn the name Tsepesh, the Impaler. He does not yet know that mothers will frighten children with stories of his cruelty, that Ottoman soldiers will flee rather than face him in battle, that his name will echo through centuries like a curse that refuses to be forgotten. But he knows one thing with the certainty of Scripture. The world has taught him that mercy is a luxury no prince can afford. that kindness is a weakness that invites destruction, and that sometimes the only way to stop the bleeding is to make sure that everyone around you bleeds harder. The boy who was taken as a hostage returns as something else entirely. Not yet the Impaler. Not yet the terror that will make sultans pause and kings reconsider their ambitions. But close, very close. The grave should have been empty, but graves in Wallachia never stay that way for long. And Vlad has learned, in the Turkish fortress where his childhood went to die, exactly what kinds of things claw their way out of the earth when the world thinks they should stay buried. The boyars feast on Easter Sunday, 1459, their tables groaning under the weight of roasted meat and honeyed wine. They do not know they are eating their last meal. In the great hall of Targoviste, where shadows dance between stone pillars like ghosts reluctant to rest, Wallachia's noble families gather to celebrate Christ's resurrection. Their silk robes rustle with the sound of expensive secrets. Their jeweled fingers tear at bread that peasants died growing. Their laughter echoes off walls that remember older, darker celebrations. They have ruled this principality for 12 years now, ever since they buried Vlad Dracula alive and watched the earth settle over his writhing form. They have grown comfortable in their power, soft in their certainty that the dragon's line died with the dragon himself. The surviving son, that pale boy who returned briefly with Turkish gold, only to flee again when Hungarian armies swept through the countryside. He is nothing more than a ghost story now, a name mothers whisper to frightened children who refuse to sleep. But ghosts, the old women know, have a way of returning when the living least expect them. The doors to the great hall swing open as the boyars raise their cups in yet another toast to their own magnificence. The hinges make no sound. Someone has oiled them carefully, deliberately, with the attention to detail that marks the difference between success and failure in enterprises that require absolute precision. Vlad enters like winter entering a warm room. He wears black from throat to boot, unadorned except for the dragon medallion that catches torchlight like a coal plucked from hell's own fire. Behind him walk 50 men, their armor polished to mirror brightness, their swords already half drawn from sheaths that have tasted blood so recently the metal still gleams wet. They move with the fluid precision of dancers who have rehearsed this performance until every step, every breath, every heartbeat falls in perfect synchronization. The laughter dies first, then the conversation. Finally, the only sound in the hall is the crackle of torches and the soft whisper of steel sliding free from leather. "My lords," Vlad says, and his voice carries the kind of quiet that makes wise men reach for weapons they pray they will not need to use. "How good of you to gather in one place. It saves considerable time and effort." The boyar, who calls himself Prince, a fat man whose name history will not trouble itself to remember, half rises from his chair, wine-stained lips working around words that refuse to form. He looks at Vlad's face and sees something there that makes his bladder release its contents in a warm rush that spreads across the front of his ceremonial robes. "You were saying something about resurrection," Vlad continues, moving deeper into the hall with steps that sound like a funeral drum beaten slowly, deliberately, with the rhythm of a heart that has stopped beating but refuses to stop pumping blood. How appropriate. How prophetic. What follows is not a battle. Battles require two sides, and the boyars, for all their silk and gold and years of comfortable brutality, are not soldiers. They are locusts who have grown fat on grain they did not plant. Wolves who have forgotten what it feels like when something bigger and hungrier comes prowling through their territory. The screaming starts when the first nobleman tries to run and discovers that Vlad's men have blocked every exit. It reaches a crescendo when the boyars realize that their guards, men they trusted, men they paid, men whose children they held as insurance against betrayal, have already changed sides or lie dead in the courtyard with their throats opened like second mouths, whispering secrets to the stars. By dawn, 500 boyar families have learned the wages of patricide. The great hall looks like an abattoir where the butchers have developed a taste for artistry along with efficiency. Bodies hang from the rafters like sides of beef, their rich clothes sodden with fluids that pool on stones, worn smooth by centuries of lesser violence. But this is only the beginning. This is merely Vlad announcing his return, clearing his throat before he begins to sing the song that will make his name echo through centuries like a curse that refuses to fade. The survivors, and Vlad always leaves survivors, because terror without witnesses is merely murder, carry word throughout Wallachia that the dragon's son has returned. Not the pale boy who fled 12 years ago, but something else entirely. Something that has learned lessons in Turkish dungeons that no Christian child should ever be taught. Something that understands power in ways that make hardened soldiers wake screaming from dreams they cannot remember clearly enough to forget. John Hunyadi receives the news in his fortress at Hunedoara, where Hungarian banners snap in mountain wind that carries the scent of spring flowers and distant smoke. The White Knight of Hungary, the man who has spent his life fighting the Ottoman advance, reads the reports from Wallachia and feels something cold settle in his stomach. He has dealt with Vlad before, first as the boy's protector, later as his enemy, always as someone who recognized potential for both greatness and catastrophe in those dark, calculating eyes. He has his father's cunning, Hunyadi tells his advisors, men who have fought beside him through decades of borderland warfare, but something else as well. Something the Turks put in him during those years of captivity. Something that makes him. He pauses, searching for words to describe an intuition that feels like ice water in his veins. Dangerous to everyone, including himself. The reports multiply through the summer of 1459 like plague boils spreading across healthy flesh. Vlad has not simply reclaimed his throne, he has transformed it into something unprecedented in the blood-soaked history of Wallachian politics. Where previous princes ruled through negotiation, bribery, and the occasional strategic assassination, Vlad governs through systematic terror applied with scientific precision. The Saxon merchants of Brasov learn this lesson when their trading posts disappear in flames that reach toward heaven like prayers spoken in a language God pretends not to understand. The German burghers who have grown rich selling Wallachian grain to Ottoman markets wake to find their warehouses burning. Their guards impaled on stakes driven so deep into the earth that the points emerge dripping from the victims' mouths. Their ledgers, carefully maintained records of decades of profitable betrayal, fuel fires that can be seen from the Turkish fortresses 30 miles south. When the survivors send envoys to negotiate, to offer tribute, to beg for mercy they have never shown their own victims, Vlad receives them in a courtyard decorated with the previous embassy. 27 Saxons rotate slowly on stakes arranged in precise geometric patterns, their bodies providing a visual demonstration of what happens when merchants mistake a prince for a customer. You may tell your masters, Vlad informs the new envoys, men whose faces have gone the color of week-old bread, that Wallachia is under new management. The terms have changed, the prices have gone up, and the penalties for non-payment are now severe. But princes, even princes who rule through terror, cannot govern in isolation. Power requires allies, and in the treacherous landscape of 15th century Europe, allies are as rare as honest merchants, and twice as dangerous. Vlad finds his match in Stephen of Moldavia, his cousin, a man who understands that survival in the borderlands requires the kind of friendship that can withstand both betrayal and success. They meet in a forest clearing where oak trees grow so thick that noon feels like twilight, where the wind carries whispers of older, darker powers that ruled these lands before Christ or Muhammad ever set foot in Europe. Two princes, both young, both carved from the same hard stone of necessity and abandonment, both bearing scars that have taught them to trust no one completely and suspect everyone constantly. The Turks think they own us, Stephen says, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who has seen too much to waste time on comfortable lies. The Hungarians think they can use us. The Poles think they can ignore us. They are all wrong. Vlad nods, recognizing a kindred spirit forged in the same fires that shaped his own understanding of power and its requirements. What do you propose? We remind them all that some dragons bite back. Their alliance, sealed with oaths spoken in a tongue older than either of their faiths, becomes the foundation for everything that follows. Two principalities, neither large enough to matter individually, binding their fates together in a partnership that will shake empires and topple thrones, and teach the world new definitions of the word ruthless. But alliances, like dragons, require feeding. And in Wallachia, Vlad discovers that the most effective food for power is fear, applied with the kind of artistic precision that transforms simple cruelty into something approaching genius. The boyars who survived Easter Sunday learn to sleep with doors barred and windows shuttered. But walls cannot keep out the kind of terror Vlad specializes in dispensing. He does not simply kill his enemies. He makes their deaths into lessons that the living study with the desperate attention of students who know their final examination will be written in their own blood. The Impaler's art is born from necessity and refined through practice. Where other princes execute traitors with swift sword strokes or clean rope nooses, Vlad discovers that death can be made to serve purposes beyond simple termination. A man impaled properly, with a stake sharpened to precise dimensions, driven through the body with mathematical precision, positioned to avoid vital organs so that dying takes hours rather than minutes, becomes more than a corpse. He becomes a message. He becomes a warning. He becomes a promise of what awaits anyone foolish enough to mistake mercy for weakness. The technique spreads through Wallachia like wildfire through drought-dead grass. Corrupt officials find themselves decorating crossroads where their slowly dying bodies can remind travelers of the new prince's attitude toward embezzlement. Merchants who water their wine or short-weight their grain discover that the penalty for fraud now involves long wooden poles and carefully calculated angles of penetration. Thieves learn that the traditional punishment of hand amputation has been replaced by something far more creative and infinitely more educational. By winter, the roads leading to Targoviste are lined with stakes like trees in an orchard of human suffering. The bodies change with the seasons, fresh ones replacing those that rot away, but the forest itself has become permanent. A grotesque testament to the principle that some lessons must be taught over and over until even the stupidest student finally comprehends the material. Foreign envoys arriving at Vlad's court must pass through this gallery of the impaled, their horses stepping carefully between stakes that drip with fluids best not examined too closely. The ambassadors who survive the experience carry tales back to their masters, stories that grow in the telling until Vlad's reputation spreads across Europe, like smoke from a burning city. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror, the man who breached the walls of Constantinople and made the Byzantine Empire a memory, receives these reports in his palace at Adrianople. He reads them once, then again, then sets them aside with the careful attention of a chess player who has just realized his opponent's strategy is far more sophisticated than he initially assumed. This Prince Vlad, he tells his advisors, men who have helped him plan the conquest of empires and the destruction of dynasties. He was our hostage once. We educated him. We shaped him. We sent him back to Wallachia as our weapon. The advisors nod, remembering the pale boy who learned Turkish so quickly, who absorbed their lessons in statecraft and strategy with the focused attention of a student who understood that knowledge was the only thing his captors could not take away from him. It appears, Mehmed continues, his voice carrying the kind of quiet that makes experienced warriors reach for their weapons, that we may have educated him too well. The Sultan's messengers ride north, carrying demands for tribute, submission, and explanations. They return carrying their companions' heads in leather bags, along with a letter written in Vlad's own hand. The message is brief, direct, and composed in the kind of Latin that would have impressed the classical scholars of Constantinople, if Constantinople still had classical scholars instead of Ottoman administrators. His Imperial Majesty is welcome to collect his tribute in person, the letter reads. I will be delighted to receive him with all the ceremony such a distinguished visitor deserves. The arrangements are already being made. The stakes are already being sharpened. Mehmed sets the letter aside and begins planning for war. Not the kind of war he fought against the Byzantines, a siege conducted with massive armies and siege engines against static fortifications, but something far more dangerous. A war against an enemy who has learned to fight like a Turk while thinking like a Christian, who has absorbed Ottoman lessons about power and applied them with the kind of creative innovation that makes even experienced conquerors pause to reconsider their assumptions. The dragon's son has returned to Wallachia, but he has brought something back with him from his years in Turkish captivity, something that makes him more dangerous than his father ever dreamed of being, something that will teach the world new words for cruelty, new definitions of terror, and new reasons to fear the darkness that gathers at the edges of civilization. The boyars are dead. The merchants have fled. The roads are decorated with warnings that speak in a universal language, understood by anyone with enough intelligence to recognize the difference between negotiation and capitulation. Vlad Tepes, the Impaler, has claimed his throne. Now he must learn to keep it. And in Wallachia, where power grows from soil, fertilized with blood and watered with tears, keeping a throne requires the kind of education that no university teaches, the kind of wisdom that can only be earned through the systematic application of terror applied with artistic precision. The lessons are about to begin. The ambassadors should have removed their turbans. They arrive at Vlad's court on a morning when frost makes the grass crunch underfoot like broken bones. Two Ottoman envoys, dressed in silk that costs more than most villages see in a decade. Their turbans, wound with cloth of gold that catches sunlight like captured flame, mark them as men of consequence in the Sultan's hierarchy. Men who expect deference. Men who have never learned that expectations, like prayers, sometimes go unanswered in ways that leave the supplicant wishing they had never opened their mouths. Your Highness, the elder ambassador says, his voice carrying the casual arrogance of a man who represents an empire that stretches from the Danube to the Euphrates. He does not bow. This is his first mistake, though not his last. His Imperial Majesty Sultan Mehmed requires your presence at court. There are matters to discuss regarding your recent activities. Vlad sits upon his throne like death, taking a brief rest, his dark robes pooling around him in ways that suggest liquid shadow given temporary form. The dragon medallion at his throat pulses with each heartbeat, as if the metal has learned to breathe. When he speaks, his voice carries the kind of quiet that makes hunting wolves pause mid-stride. Your turbans, he says, remove them. It is customary when addressing a Christian prince in his own hall. The ambassadors exchange glances that speak volumes in the silent language diplomats master or die learning. The younger one, perhaps sensing currents in the air that his companion cannot feel, raises a tentative hand toward his head, but the elder man stops him with a gesture sharp as a blade drawn in anger. We serve the Padishah of the House of Osman, the elder says, his chin lifting with pride that will kill him before the day ends. We uncover our heads for no infidel, no matter what throne he squats upon. Vlad nods, as if the ambassador has just provided the correct answer to a question that has been troubling him. How refreshing. A man of principles, so rare in these modern times. He gestures to his guards, men who have been waiting for this signal with the patient attention of cats watching mousehole. Since these gentlemen's convictions are so firmly rooted, perhaps we should help them maintain their devotion. permanently. The hammers strike with scientific precision, 3 blows each, driving iron nails through cloth of gold and flesh and bone until the turbans become permanent fixtures, part of the ambassador's skulls now, wedding silk to bone in a marriage that will last until carrion birds separate what Vlad has joined together. The younger envoy dies quickly, his neck snapping when shock makes him jerk too violently against the nail anchoring his turban to his skull. The elder man lives longer, long enough to understand exactly what has happened, long enough to appreciate the artistic irony of his situation. "Your devotion is admirable," Vlad tells the dying ambassador, whose eyes still flicker with the kind of rage that comes from a lifetime of giving orders and never receiving them. "Tell your sultan that Wallachia has learned new customs during his absence. Tell him that the next embassy he sends should come prepared to show proper respect, or they will find themselves as permanently attached to my court as you have become." But the dead carry no messages, and Vlad knows this. The hammered turbans serve a different purpose entirely. They announce to anyone with wit enough to read the signs that the age of accommodation has ended. That the boy who once learned Turkish verbs in Ottoman dungeons has returned as something that speaks a different language entirely, one written in blood and punctuated with screams. The news spreads outward from Targovishte like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, each circle larger than the last, each one carrying word that Wallachia has acquired a new prince, and that this prince has acquired tastes that make hardened soldiers wake screaming from dreams they cannot quite remember, clearly enough to forget completely. The Saxon merchants of Brasov learn the depth of their miscalculation when their morning opens to the sound of iron-shod hooves on cobblestones and the hungry crackle of flames that have found fresh fuel. Vlad's horsemen sweep through the German quarter like a plague with cavalry training, their torches turning counting houses into funeral pyres, and their swords transforming profit margins into mortality statistics. The burghers who built their fortunes selling Wallachian grain to Ottoman markets watch their warehouses become monuments to the proposition that some business relationships carry hidden costs that compound with interest until the final bill comes due in forms no bookkeeper ever learned to calculate. Those who survive, and Vlad always ensures there are survivors because terror without witnesses is merely murder, flee with stories that grow in the telling until they reach proportions that make listeners question whether the tellers have confused reality with nightmare. But the survivors speak truth, even when that truth sounds like madness. They describe forests of stakes arranged in geometric precision, each one crowned with a body positioned to achieve maximum educational impact. They speak of impalement techniques that transform dying into a performance art, a grotesque ballet where the dancers writhe for hours before achieving the release of death. The method becomes legend, then science, then sacrament in the liturgy of Vlad's rule. The stakes must be sharpened to precise specifications, pointed enough to penetrate flesh, blunt enough to avoid immediate death, too sharp and the victim dies quickly, wasting the educational opportunity. Too blunt and penetration becomes impossible, defeating the purpose entirely. The angle of insertion requires mathematical calculation, avoiding vital organs while ensuring that gravity and time will combine to create a prolonged demonstration of what happens when men mistake the Prince of Wallachia for someone who negotiates. The long stake enters through the rectum and emerges from the mouth, creating a human banner that proclaims Vlad's policies in a universal language that transcends barriers of nationality, religion, or education. The short stake penetrates the chest or abdomen, allowing for longer survival and more extensive suffering, perfect for cases where the victim's crimes warrant extended consideration. But technique alone does not make an artist. What elevates Vlad's impalements from simple brutality to something approaching genius is his understanding of theatre, his recognition that death can serve purposes beyond mere termination when properly staged for maximum psychological impact. The forest of the impaled grows throughout the winter of 1459, like a crop planted in soil, fertilized with screams and watered with tears. 20,000 stakes rise from the frozen ground in patterns that speak of careful planning and meticulous execution. The bodies change as the seasons turn, fresh victims replacing those that rot away. But the forest itself becomes a permanent feature of the Wallachian landscape, visible from miles away, unforgettable to anyone who sees it. Foreign merchants traveling the trade roads that connect Constantinople with Vienna must pass through this gallery of human suffering, their pack animals stepping carefully between stakes that drip fluids best not examined too closely. The lucky ones close their eyes and trust their horses to find safe passage. The unlucky ones look too closely and carry images back to their home countries that spread Vlad's reputation like plague spores carried on the wind. Diplomatic correspondence from this period reads like dispatches from a war zone where the usual rules of engagement have been suspended indefinitely. Venetian traders write to their sponsors about a Wallachian prince who has transformed statecraft into a form of performance art too terrible for Christian eyes to contemplate. Hungarian nobles send coded messages to their allies warning that the dragon's son has returned from Turkish captivity with lessons that no Christian soul should ever learn. Even Ottoman chroniclers, men accustomed to recording the rise and fall of empires with the dispassionate precision of clerks inventorying grain stores, find themselves reaching for metaphors when they attempt to describe what Vlad has created in Wallachia. He has made of his principality a theatre, writes one, where the only drama performed is the tragedy of death, and the only audience that matters is fear itself. But Vlad's artistry extends beyond simple impalement. He understands that true terror requires variety, innovation, the kind of creative thinking that keeps his subjects guessing about what fresh horrors await those who mistake his mercy for weakness. The beggar who claims to be crippled but walks normally when he thinks no one is watching discovers that Vlad takes a personal interest in cases of fraudulent disability. The stake enters through his feet and exits through his skull, creating a monument to the principle that pretending to be unable to walk can lead to permanent immobility. The merchant who dilutes his wine learns that Vlad considers honesty in commercial transactions a matter of life and death, literally. The impalement enters through his mouth and exits through his rectum, allowing the wine he sold to flow out of him in a grotesque parody of the serving process. The wife who betrays her husband discovers that Vlad takes adultery personally. Her impalement begins where her sin was committed, the stake entering her body in ways that make the punishment fit the crime with the kind of poetic justice that would be admirable if it were not so absolutely horrifying. These are not random acts of cruelty, but calculated demonstrations of principle, each one designed to illustrate specific aspects of Vlad's political philosophy. Crime and punishment balanced with mathematical precision. Cause and effect demonstrated through methods that ensure the lesson is remembered by anyone fortunate enough to survive the educational process. The boyars who remain, those few noble families that survived the Easter Sunday massacre, learn to walk carefully through a world where their traditional privileges have been replaced by new rules that make their ancestors' casual brutalities seem like children's games. They discover that centuries of inherited authority mean nothing to a prince who has learned to measure power, not in bloodlines or landed estates, but in the simple ability to make enemies choose between submission and stakes. The peasants, surprisingly, begin to prosper, not from any sentimental attachment to the common people, but because Vlad understands that a prince's strength flows from the productivity of his subjects, and productive subjects require protection from the kinds of predators that have traditionally fed on their labor. When boyars attempt to levy illegal taxes, they find themselves contributing to the forest of the impaled instead of their treasure chambers. When merchants try to cheat peasants on grain prices, they discover that the penalty for fraud now includes prolonged consideration of their mathematical errors, while suspended on pointed wooden poles. The roads that once crawled with bandits become safer than they have been in living memory, Not because Vlad has hired more guards, but because highway robbery now carries consequences that make even the most desperate criminals seek alternative employment. The stakes that line the major thoroughfares hold enough former highwaymen to serve as permanent reminders that some career changes are permanent. Foreign observers struggle to categorize what they are witnessing. Is it justice or brutality? Statecraft or sadism? The creation of order or the unleashing of chaos? The answer depends entirely on which side of the stake one happens to be standing on, and Vlad has made it very clear which side he prefers his subjects to occupy. By the summer of 1460, Vlad's reputation has spread across Europe like smoke from a burning city. Papal nuncios include prayers for his soul in their correspondence, though they are careful to specify whether they are praying for his salvation or his swift death. German chroniclers begin collecting stories about the Wallachian prince who has redefined the word ruthless in ways that make their language feel inadequate to the task of description. The Ottoman Empire takes notice with the focused attention of a surgeon examining a tumor that has appeared in an inconvenient location. Sultan Mehmed II receives reports that would be dismissed as fantasy if they came from less reliable sources, accounts of a vassal prince who has transformed his tiny principality into something that makes even experienced Ottoman administrators reach for stronger wine when the day's correspondence includes dispatches from the Wallachian frontier. "He was our student once," the Sultan tells his advisors, men who remember the pale boy who learned their lessons with such frightening efficiency. "We taught him strategy. We taught him statecraft. We taught him that power flows from the willingness to do what others cannot or will not do." The advisors nod, though several make the subtle hand signs that ward off the evil eye. They remember Vlad as a child, but the reports they read describe something else entirely, something that has taken their teachings and refined them into forms that make even hardened Turkish veterans question whether some knowledge is too dangerous to impart to foreign hostages. "Perhaps," one advisor suggests with the careful tone of a man testing the weight of ice before stepping onto a frozen river, "it would be wise to reconsider his status as a vassal. He seems to have developed interpretations of loyalty that differ from our own." Mehmed studies the latest reports, accounts of impaled Turkish merchants and Ottoman envoys with turbans nailed to their skulls. His empire stretches from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, commands armies that make kings tremble, and treasures that make sultans of lesser realms weep with envy. But in the mountains of Wallachia, a prince he once held as hostage has created something that makes even the conqueror of Constantinople pause to recalculate the odds. Send another embassy, he finally decides. But this time, send men who understand that diplomacy with Prince Vlad requires different protocols than we typically employ. The new ambassadors receive instructions that read like military orders, combined with religious rites. They are told to show respect. They are told to remove their turbans. They are told to carry gifts instead of demands, proposals instead of ultimatums. Most importantly, they are told to remember that they serve an empire, but they are visiting a man who has transformed his principality into something that defies easy categorization. Something that might be a kingdom, or might be an elaborate trap, or might be the fever dream of a mind that has learned too much about power and its applications. The stakes surrounding Targoviste have grown taller over the summer, their crowns now visible from distances that would have been unimaginable when Vlad first returned to claim his throne. The Forest of the Impaled has become a landmark that merchants use for navigation, a grotesque compass that points toward the court of a prince who has redefined hospitality in terms that make even devils pause to admire the craftsmanship. Winter approaches Wallachia like a prayer whispered in a language God pretends not to understand. The stakes wear crowns of snow that make their burdens look almost peaceful, almost dignified, until the wind shifts and carries the scent that reminds travelers that some decorations serve purposes beyond mere ornamentation. Vlad Tepes, the Impaler, sits upon his throne and surveys a principality that has learned to speak his language fluently. It is a dialect written in blood and punctuated with screams, but it is remarkably effective at communicating the basic principles that govern life and death in this small corner of Europe, where terror has been elevated to the status of high art. The boy who was taken as hostage has returned as something else entirely, something that makes sultans pause and kings reconsider their assumptions about the relationship between power and its proper applications. The education is complete. The examinations have been graded. The results are visible from miles away, a forest of wooden monuments to the proposition that some lessons, once learned, are never forgotten. The Impaler King has claimed his throne. Now the world must learn to live with what they have created through their casual cruelties and convenient betrayals. The stakes are waiting. The hammers are ready. And Vlad has developed a taste for teaching lessons that no university includes in its curriculum. But every survivor carries with them until their dying day. The wells should have been sweet, but Vlad has poisoned them all. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror, the sword of Islam, the man who breached the walls of Constantinople and made the Byzantine Empire a memory written in blood and gold, rides north through a landscape that has been systematically transformed into a monument to spite. His army stretches behind him like a river of steel and silk, 60,000 men who have conquered empires and toppled dynasties, who have planted the Crescent banner on the walls of cities that once thought themselves eternal. But the countryside they pass through offers no welcome, no submission, no acknowledgement that the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire deserves anything more than the bitter hospitality of a land that has chosen death over dishonor. The villages are empty, not abandoned, emptied, burned to ash and timber, their wells filled with stones and corpses, their grain stores scattered to feed crows instead of armies. The roads have been torn up, their stones scattered like broken teeth, across fields that have been salted until nothing will grow for generations. Even the trees have been cut down, their stumps poisoned so thoroughly that the earth itself seems to recoil from any attempt at cultivation. This is scorched earth raised to the level of art, destruction planned with the mathematical precision of an architect designing cathedrals. Every bridge has been collapsed. Every mill wheel has been smashed. Every source of fresh water has been contaminated with substances that make even battle-hardened Turkish soldiers turn away in disgust. Mehmed rides through this wasteland with the grim appreciation of a master craftsman, recognizing exceptional work in his chosen field. He taught the boy who became Vlad Tepes, educated him in the palace schools, where Ottoman princes learn the arts of war and statecraft. But somewhere in that education process, the student absorbed lessons that the teacher never intended to impart. Techniques that transform battlefield tactics into forms of artistic expression, too terrible for civilized minds to fully comprehend. He means to starve us, one of the Sultan's generals observes, a man who has planned the siege of Constantinople and lived to see its walls crumble beneath Turkish cannons. Drive us back without ever offering battle. Mehmed nods, though his attention remains fixed on the horizon, where mountains rise like broken teeth against a sky the color of old blood. Somewhere in those peaks, in castles that perch on cliff faces like eagles' nests, the former hostage has made his preparations, not just for battle, but for something that transcends mere warfare and enters the realm of personal vendetta pursued with religious devotion. He means more than starvation, the Sultan replies, his voice carrying the kind of quiet that makes experienced soldiers check their weapons without conscious thought. He means to teach us fear, to show us that some students learn their lessons too well. The Turkish army pushes deeper into Wallachia, like a sword sliding into a wound that has been specifically prepared to receive it. The landscape continues to offer its poisoned hospitality. rivers that run black with substances that make horses sicken and die, forests where every tree has been felled to create barriers that channel advancing armies into killing fields prepared with obsessive attention to detail. But it is the stakes that truly announce Vlad's intentions. They begin appearing along the roadside like mile markers in hell, each one crowned with a Turkish soldier who learned too late that scouting ahead of the main army carries risks that no amount of combat experience can adequately prepare a man to face. The impalement techniques have been refined since the early experiments, perfected through practice until they achieve effects that make even Ottoman veterans, men who have seen the sack of cities and the slaughter of populations, pause to appreciate the craftsmanship involved. The bodies are arranged in order of military rank, a grotesque table of organization that demonstrates Vlad's intimate knowledge of Turkish army structure. Common soldiers hang from shorter stakes, their deaths relatively quick. Officers occupy taller poles, positioned to ensure longer suffering and greater visibility. At crossroads where multiple paths converge, the highest-ranking captives rotate slowly on stakes tall enough to be seen for miles, their dying bodies serving as navigation aids for an army that has begun to understand it is not invading a country, but entering a trap. The psychological impact spreads through the Turkish ranks like plague through a crowded city. Veterans who have fought across 3 continents begin to sleep poorly, their dreams filled with images of wooden points and slowly spinning bodies. Young soldiers who joined the army for glory and plunder discover that some campaigns offer neither, only the opportunity to learn why their fathers warned them that certain enemies should be left undisturbed in their mountain fastnesses. Reports reach Mehmed's tent each morning, like dispatches from a war being fought in hell's outer provinces. Scouting parties that vanish completely, leaving only stakes to mark their passage. Supply convoys that arrive empty, their guards impaled, and their contents scattered across hillsides in patterns that suggest ritual significance beyond mere destruction. But most disturbing are the bodies that appear each dawn arranged around the Turkish camp. Corpses positioned with such precision that they must have been placed by men who can move through Turkish lines like ghosts, invisible to sentries who thought themselves alert, undetectable by guards who prided themselves on their vigilance. "He is in our camp," whispers spread through the army like wildfire through drought-dead grass. "He walks among us. He watches while we sleep." The truth is both simpler and more terrifying. Vlad has not infiltrated the Turkish camp. He has turned the entire principality into his weapon, transformed every hill and valley into components of a machine designed for killing invaders with maximum efficiency and minimum risk to the defender. The mountains of Wallachia become allies in ways that make Turkish military engineers weep with frustration. Passes that should allow cavalry charges instead funnel horsemen into narrow defiles, where archers hidden in caves can kill at leisure. Roads that appear suitable for artillery trains dissolve into muddy traps that swallow cannons like hungry mouths. Rivers that promise fresh water deliver poison that kills slowly, over days, with symptoms that make the dying beg for the mercy of immediate execution. This is not the kind of warfare taught in the military academies of Istanbul, not the sort of campaign chronicled in the histories of great conquests. This is something that transcends strategy and enters the realm of personal hatred, refined through years of careful consideration into forms that make experienced generals question whether some enemies are too dangerous to be defeated. The night attack comes without warning because warnings, Vlad has learned, diminish the educational impact of practical demonstrations. June 17th, 1462. The Turkish camp spreads across the Wallachian plain like a city of silken steel, its pavilions glowing with the warm light of oil lamps and cooking fires. 60,000 men settle into sleep with the confidence that comes from overwhelming numerical superiority and the comfortable certainty that morning will bring them closer to crushing this irritating mosquito of a principality that has dared to challenge Ottoman authority. The sentries die first, their throats open so quietly that their companions continue their conversations with corpses for precious minutes before realizing that the responses they thought they heard were actually the wind whistling through severed windpipes. The guards posted around the Sultan's pavilion discovered that Wallachian steel cuts through Ottoman silk with the same efficiency it demonstrates on Ottoman flesh. Vlad strikes at the army's heart like lightning given human form, his raiders moving through the sleeping camp with the fluid precision of dancers who have rehearsed this performance until every step, every sword stroke, every whispered word falls in perfect synchronization. They do not attempt to destroy the entire Turkish force. Such an effort would be both impossible and unnecessary. Instead, they target the elements that transform an army from a mob into a military instrument. The officers, the standard bearers, the trumpeters, whose calls coordinate movement and morale. Most importantly, they hunt the Sultan himself. Mehmed wakes to the sound of steel singing against steel and the wet whisper of blades parting flesh, sounds that penetrate his dreams and drag him into a waking nightmare where his great pavilion has become a trap and his bodyguards have become corpses. Through the silk walls, he can see shadows dancing in firelight, figures that move with purpose too terrible to be random violence, too organized to be mere raid. The conqueror of Constantinople, the man who has never known defeat in 30 years of warfare, rolls from his sleeping couch and reaches for weapons that suddenly seem inadequate to the task of preserving a life that has, until this moment, seemed charmed by destiny and protected by divine favor. A blade parts the pavilion's silk wall like scissors cutting through dreams, and through the gap steps a figure that makes Mehmed's blood turn to ice water in his veins. Not because he recognizes the face. Years have changed the boy he once knew beyond easy recognition. But because he recognizes something deeper, more fundamental. The way the figure moves, the angle of the sword in his hand, the expression in his eyes that speaks of lessons learned and examinations passed with the kind of perfect scores that are written in other men's blood. Vlad. The Sultan's voice carries no surprise, only the grim recognition of a chess player who has just realized his opponent's strategy 3 moves too late. Your Imperial Majesty. Vlad's response carries the perfect court courtesy he learned in Turkish palaces. But underneath the formal words runs something that makes the Sultan reach for his scimitar with hands that have begun to shake. How good of you to accept my invitation. I hope you are finding Wallachia's hospitality memorable. What follows lasts perhaps 30 seconds in real time, but those 30 seconds contain enough violence to fuel nightmares for the remainder of both men's lives. Steel rings against steel with the pure notes of bells tolling for the dead. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, veteran of 100 battles, discovers that his former hostage has learned swordsmanship in schools, where failure means more than embarrassment. It means a stake prepared with personal attention to the dying process. Only the intervention of Turkish reinforcements, guards who finally understand that the sounds of battle are not coming from the camp's perimeter, but from its very center, prevents the night attack from ending with the Sultan's head on a Wallachian spear. Vlad withdraws as suddenly as he appeared, melting back into darkness that seems to welcome him like a lover embracing her beloved. But the damage extends far beyond the number of dead Turks left, scattered around the imperial pavilion. An army that went to sleep confident of victory wakes to discover that their enemy can reach the Sultan himself in the heart of their camp. That their overwhelming numbers mean nothing against an opponent who fights by rules they were never taught to counter. Mehmed survives the night, but something in his eyes dies during those 30 seconds of steel song and shadow dance. For the first time in his adult life, the conqueror has confronted an enemy who might actually conquer him, and the knowledge sits in his stomach like poisoned wine, bitter and impossible to forget. Dawn reveals the true scope of Vlad's artistry. The Turkish dead have been arranged in patterns around the camp's perimeter, their bodies positioned with the kind of attention to detail that transforms battlefield carnage into something approaching sculpture. The message they spell out, written in corpses and readable from the Sultan's pavilion, consists of 3 words in perfect Ottoman Turkish: "Welcome to Wallachia." But it is the forest that breaks the Turkish army's will to continue. The forest of the impaled has grown throughout the spring like a crop planted in soil fertilized with screams and watered with tears. 20,000 stakes rise from the earth in geometric patterns that speak of mathematical precision applied to human suffering. The bodies that crown these wooden monuments represent every level of Ottoman society. Merchants who thought their gold would protect them, soldiers who believed their swords would save them, diplomats who assumed their immunity would preserve them. At the forest's center, on a stake taller than the rest, a figure rotates slowly in the morning breeze. The Turkish banners that should have announced his rank and honors have been twisted into a grotesque parody of imperial regalia, silk standards now serving as funeral shrouds for a man whose identification makes even veteran campaigners question their assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. Hamza Pasha, cousin to the Sultan himself, general of armies and conqueror of kingdoms, hangs from his stake with the patient attention to detail that marks all of Vlad's artistic endeavors. His impalement began at sunset 3 days ago and will not end until sunset 3 days hence, a demonstration of technique that makes even hardened Turkish veterans turn away rather than witness the educational process in its entirety. Mehmed stares at his cousin's slowly revolving form and feels something cold settle in the place where his courage used to live. Not fear exactly. Fear is what common soldiers feel when arrows whistle overhead or cavalry charges thunder toward their ranks. This is something deeper, more fundamental, the recognition that he has encountered an enemy who fights wars in a different language entirely, one written in suffering and punctuated with death. "Your Imperial Majesty," one of his generals ventures, his voice carrying the careful tone of a man testing the weight of ice before stepping onto a frozen river. Perhaps a strategic withdrawal would be prudent. We can return with larger forces, better preparations, more comprehensive plans. The Sultan continues staring at the forest where his cousin dies by degrees, each revolution of the stake carrying Hamza Pasha through another cycle of agony carefully calculated to last exactly as long as Vlad intends it to last. The mathematics involved in such precision speaks of a mind that has studied suffering with the same devotion that scholars apply to philosophy or priests bring to theology. "He learned this from us," Mehmed finally says, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who has just solved a puzzle that he wishes had remained forever unsolved. "We taught him that power comes from the willingness to do what others cannot or will not do. We showed him that strength flows from the systematic application of techniques that make enemies choose between submission and destruction." The general nods, though his attention remains fixed on the forest, where 20,000 voices whisper lessons in a dialect that makes even Turkish soldiers, men who have sacked cities and enslaved populations, question whether some knowledge is too terrible to be passed from teacher to student. The problem, the Sultan continues, his voice now carrying something that might be admiration if it were not so thoroughly poisoned with horror, is that he learned the lessons too well. He took our teachings and refined them into something we never intended to create. The Turkish army begins its withdrawal that afternoon, not in defeat, but in recognition that some victories cost more than they are worth. They leave behind their artillery, their supplies, their siege engines, anything that might slow their retreat from a principality that has transformed itself into a machine designed for killing invaders with artistic precision. But they also leave behind something more precious: the comfortable certainty that the Ottoman Empire can conquer anything it chooses to conquer, that Turkish armies are invincible, that the Sultan's will is sufficient to reshape the world according to his desires. The boy who was once held hostage in Turkish palaces watches their retreat from the walls of Tergoviste, his dark robes stirring in mountain wind that carries the scent of snow and old blood. Around him, the stakes that crown his city's defenses continue their slow rotation, their burdens teaching lessons in a universal language that transcends barriers of nationality, religion, or military experience. Vlad Tepes has achieved something unprecedented in the bloody history of Ottoman expansion. He has made an empire blink, not through superior numbers or advanced technology or divine intervention, but through the systematic application of terror refined into an art form that makes even hardened conquerors question whether some enemies are too dangerous to be defeated. The Crescent has met the cross in the mountains of Wallachia, and for the first time in living memory, it is the Crescent that turns away, carrying with it the knowledge that somewhere in the Christian lands, a prince has learned to fight holy war with methods that make devils pause to admire the craftsmanship involved. But victories, like dragons, sometimes carry prices that are not immediately apparent. The Turkish army may have withdrawn, but Mehmed the Conqueror has a long memory and unlimited resources. He will return, eventually, with larger forces and more comprehensive plans. And when he does, he will bring with him something that Vlad may not have anticipated in his calculations. Radu the Fair, the golden brother who learned different lessons during those shared years of captivity, who chose accommodation where Vlad chose resistance, who survived by bending where his brother chose to break anyone who tried to bend him. The Forest of Stakes continues its silent teaching, but winter is coming to Wallachia, and winter, the old women know, is when wolves hunt in packs and brothers discover that blood, despite what the poets claim, is not always thicker than ambition. The printing presses of Nuremberg sing their metal songs through the night, each revolution of their wheels spreading poison disguised as ink. In workshops where German craftsmen bend over type that gleams like scattered stars in candlelight, where apprentices feed paper to machines that devour trees and excrete nightmares, the story of Vlad Tepes transforms from historical record into something far more dangerous. Popular entertainment designed to make Christian burghers shiver deliciously over their morning bread and evening wine. The frightening and truly extraordinary story of a wicked blood-drinking tyrant called Prince Dracula. The title sprawls across pamphlets that multiply like plague spores, each copy carrying tales that grow in the telling until they achieve proportions that make reality seem modest by comparison. The Saxon merchants who fled Brasov with their clothes still smoking from Wallachian flames have found their revenge in printer's ink, transforming their humiliation into profitable horror stories that sell faster than the presses can produce them. But truth, like wine, ferments differently depending on who controls the barrel. In the workshops of Nuremberg, Vlad becomes a monster who drinks blood from golden chalices and dines on human flesh served on silver platters. The German pamphlets describe feasts where roasted children are the main course, where impaled victims are seasoned with herbs before being served to guests who have learned to appreciate such delicacies. They speak of a prince who tortures prisoners for entertainment, who orders mass executions for his personal amusement, who has transformed his court into a theatre where the only drama performed is human suffering, elevated to the status of art. The stories spread across Europe like fire through drought-dead grass, each retelling adding new details, fresh horrors, additional evidence of Wallachian monstrosity that makes Christian readers thank God they live in civilized lands where such things could never happen. Merchants carry the tales from city to city like traveling salesmen peddling fear. Priests read excerpts from pulpits as cautionary examples of what happens when Christian princes abandon themselves to diabolic influences. But in the scriptoriums of Moscow, where Russian monks copy chronicles by candlelight that flickers like captured souls, the same events acquire different meanings entirely. The tale of Dracula, the voivode, emerges from orthodox pens like prayer given written form, transforming Vlad from German monster into Slavic saint, from Western devil into Eastern defender of the faith. Here, in manuscripts illuminated with gold that catches light like frozen fire, Vlad becomes the prince who defended orthodoxy against both Catholic corruption and Islamic conquest, who used violence not from cruelty but from necessity, who applied terror with the surgical precision of a physician cutting away diseased flesh to save the patient's life. The Russian chroniclers understand something their German counterparts miss, that in the borderlands between empires, between faiths, between the civilized and the barbarous, survival sometimes requires methods that make comfortable Christians in safe cities reach for stronger wine when the evening prayers are finished. They write of a prince who punished the corrupt, protected the innocent, and died defending lands that other rulers abandoned to Turkish conquest. The Ottoman chroniclers, writing in Arabic script that flows across parchment like liquid shadow, create their own version of the Wallachian prince who taught the Sultan's armies that some Christians bite back harder than expected. In their accounts, Vlad becomes Kazıklı Bey, the Impaler Prince, a title that carries grudging respect along with its burden of horror. They describe him not as a random sadist, but as a worthy enemy, a foe whose methods, while abhorrent to civilized minds, achieved results that commanded attention from the highest levels of Ottoman command. He fought like a Turk while thinking like a Christian, one chronicler notes with the professional appreciation of a craftsman recognizing exceptional work in his chosen field. This made him more dangerous than 10 princes who possessed only courage or only cunning, but lacked the terrible wisdom that comes from understanding both one's enemy and oneself. But the most complex portrait emerges from the most unexpected source. The testimonies of Wallachian peasants who lived through Vlad's reign and survived to compare his rule with what came before and after. In taverns where firelight dances on faces weathered by decades of watching armies pass through fields, they planted with grain and watered with tears. The common people speak of Chepesh with voices that carry neither worship nor condemnation, but something more nuanced, recognition. They remember a prince who made the roads safe for travelers, who hanged corrupt officials from trees that became shrines to honest governance, who protected peasant grain from boyar theft, with methods that ensured the protection remained permanent. The stakes were full, one old woman tells her grandchildren while spinning wool into thread that will outlast the stories she weaves around it. But the roads were empty of bandits. The prince was cruel, but he was cruel to those who deserved cruelty. The boyars who stole our grain fed crows instead of themselves. The Turks who burned our villages became scarecrows in fields they would never harvest. This is the mathematics of survival in lands where mercy is a luxury that few can afford, and fewer still can survive. The peasants understand, in ways that make German merchants and Russian monks seem naive, that sometimes the only choice available is between different kinds of terror, and that a prince who directs his violence toward those who prey on the weak serves justice even when his methods make angels weep. The legendary tales multiply through the winter months like stars appearing in a darkening sky, each one adding new details to a portrait that becomes less historical record than collective nightmare, shared fantasy, communal fever dream that reveals more about the dreamers than about the man who inspired their visions. In German pamphlets, Vlad invites beggars to a feast and then burns down the hall with all the guests inside, claiming he wishes to free them from the burden of poverty. The story serves German middle-class anxieties about social disorder, their fear that revolution might come disguised as charity, their need to believe that cruelty always reveals itself through obviously monstrous actions that decent people can easily recognize and avoid. In Russian chronicles, the same event becomes a test of spiritual worth, where Vlad separates the truly needy from professional beggars who exploit Christian charity for personal gain. The fire becomes purification rather than murder, divine justice administered through earthly instruments that understand the difference between deserving poverty and fraudulent destitution. The Ottoman accounts focus on military aspects, describing how Vlad used such spectacles to demonstrate his control over his subjects' life and death. His ability to command absolute obedience through carefully calculated displays of power. For Turkish chroniclers, the Beggar's Feast illustrates tactical thinking applied to domestic governance, the use of terror as a tool of statecraft rather than an expression of personal pathology. But perhaps the most revealing stories come from sources that have no political agenda beyond survival. The testimonies of merchants, diplomats, and travelers who encountered Vlad personally and lived to describe the experience to audiences hungry for first-hand accounts of legendary brutality. Their descriptions paint a portrait that defies easy categorization. They speak of a prince who could discuss theology with learned priests and military strategy with veteran commanders, who maintained a court where scholars felt welcome and artists found patronage. They describe conversations conducted in perfect Latin, displays of courtesy that would not seem out of place in the most refined European capitals, demonstrations of knowledge that revealed wide reading and careful thought. But they also describe eyes that seemed to look through visitors rather than at them, as if evaluating not their words or their intentions but their structural integrity under stress. Their potential usefulness as raw materials for projects that decent minds preferred not to contemplate too closely. They speak of silences that stretched too long, smiles that revealed too much, casual remarks about punishment and death that suggested familiarity with subjects that most princes delegated to executioners and forgot as quickly as possible. He was perfectly civilized, one Venetian envoy writes to his superiors back home, until the moment when civility no longer served his purposes. Then he became something else entirely, something that made me understand why his enemies choose death over capture, why his allies sleep poorly, and why merchants who trade with Wallachia include prayers for safe passage in their standard commercial contracts. The legend grows through repetition, but also through deliberate cultivation. Vlad understands, with the political sophistication he learned in Ottoman courts, that reputation can serve as a weapon more effective than armies, that terror properly applied can achieve results that no amount of conventional force can match. He allows stories about his cruelty to spread, even encourages them through carefully staged displays designed to reinforce his growing reputation as a prince who has transcended normal human limitations and entered territory where only devils and saints dare to tread. When Polish ambassadors visit his court, they find their horses' heads mounted on stakes outside the city gates, not as a threat, but as a lesson in the importance of bringing proper gifts when calling upon princes who have strong opinions about diplomatic protocol. When Hungarian nobles send envoys to discuss border disputes, the envoys return with their diplomatic credentials nailed to their skulls, not from sadism, but as a practical demonstration of Wallachian policy regarding certain types of negotiation. Each story reinforces the growing legend of a prince who has made cruelty into a science, terror into an art form, death into a teaching tool that educates through methods that make conventional pedagogical approaches seem hopelessly inadequate. The tales serve Vlad's purposes by making his enemies think twice before challenging him directly, but they also serve deeper needs in the European imagination, fulfilling a hunger for stories that explain how Christian civilization can produce monsters that rival anything the pagan world ever spawned. The contradiction at the heart of Vlad's legend, saint or devil, hero or monster, defender or destroyer, reflects broader tensions in 15th century Christian thought about the relationship between faith and violence, between civilization and barbarism, between the methods that preserve Christian society and the values that Christian society claims to represent. Medieval theology teaches that God sometimes works through violent instruments, that divine justice occasionally requires earthly agents who are willing to damn their own souls for the greater good of Christendom. The Crusades established precedents for holy violence, for wars fought with methods that would be criminal in any other context, but become sacramental when properly sanctified by religious authority and directed toward approved targets. Vlad's violence fits uncomfortably within this framework because it serves no higher authority than his own will, follows no religious guidelines beyond his personal interpretation of justice, and recognizes no limits beyond those imposed by practical considerations of effectiveness. He uses the methods of holy war but fights for secular purposes, applies crusading techniques to domestic governance, and transforms religious concepts of righteous violence into political tools that serve dynastic rather than spiritual ends. This theological ambiguity makes Vlad simultaneously fascinating and repulsive to Christian audiences who want to condemn his methods but cannot entirely dismiss his results. He protects Christian lands from Islamic conquest, defends peasants from aristocratic exploitation, and maintains order in territories where chaos would mean death for thousands of innocent people. But he achieves these ends through means that make Christian moralists question whether some victories are too expensive to celebrate, some methods too corrupting to employ, some forms of success too dangerous to admire. The legend continues growing through the long winter nights when storytellers gather around fires that burn like captured stars and spin tales that will outlive the tellers, the listeners, and the man who inspired them. Each telling adds new details, fresh horrors, additional evidence of either sainthood or monstrosity, depending on who controls the narrative and what purposes it serves in their particular understanding of how the world works. But legends, like dragons, sometimes develop lives of their own that escape the control of those who created them. The stories about Vlad Tepes spread beyond their original contexts, cross linguistic and cultural boundaries, and begin to serve needs that their creators never intended to fulfill. In centuries to come, these tales will provide raw material for very different kinds of stories. Narratives that transform the historical prince into something that transcends history entirely and enters the realm of pure myth. The blood-drinking tyrant of German pamphlets will evolve into creatures that haunt dreams rather than battlefields, monsters that prey on souls rather than political enemies, devils that offer immortality at prices that make death seem like mercy. But that transformation lies in the future, beyond the reach of the man who sits upon his throne in Turgoviste and reads reports that arrive like dispatches from a war being fought in the realm of collective imagination. For now, Vlad remains human, mortal, vulnerable to the kinds of betrayals that have always destroyed princes who trust too much and forgive too little. The legend serves his purposes, but legends, once released into the world, follow their own laws and serve their own ends. They outlive their creators and outlast their original meanings, becoming something larger and stranger and more terrible than the historical events that inspired them. The printing presses continue their metal songs through the night, each revolution of their wheels carrying Vlad's name farther from historical fact and closer to mythic truth. But in the mountains of Wallachia, where winter wind carries the scent of snow and old blood, the man behind the legend prepares for battles that will be fought not in the realm of stories, but in the world where swords draw real blood and stakes hold real corpses. The legend is growing, but the man must still survive. And survival in the borderlands between empires requires more than reputation. It demands the kind of vigilance that never sleeps and the kind of ruthlessness that never hesitates when hesitation means death. The stories will outlive the storyteller, but only if the storyteller lives long enough to become worthy of the stories being told about him. The coffin should have stayed closed, but in 1897, an Irish lawyer opens it with a key made of words. Abraham Stoker sits in his study at 27 Cheney Walk, where Thames fog presses against windows like the breath of something that has learned to wait patiently for its moment to enter the world of the living. Around him, papers scatter across a desk that groans beneath the weight of research accumulated through years of hunting legends, through libraries, chasing stories through correspondence, following whispers through the dark corners where history bleeds into myth. He does not know he is about to resurrect the dead. He believes he is simply writing a novel. The books that surround him speak in voices that echo across centuries. Arminius Vambery's tales of Transylvanian folklore, Emily Gerard's accounts of Romanian superstitions, William Wilkinson's dry academic tome about Wallachian princes whose names have become whispers in the wind. But it is one name that calls to him across the gulf of 400 years, one story that demands to be told again in a new tongue for audiences who have forgotten the original lessons. Vlad Dracula, the son of the dragon. The prince who taught the world new definitions of cruelty and gave death itself a name that children still whisper when shadows grow too long and night settles over the earth like a funeral shroud drawn across the face of a corpse. Stoker lifts his pen and begins to write, not knowing that he is about to perform a resurrection more complete than any achieved by the historical princes who inspired it. The ink flows across paper like blood across stone, each word adding flesh to bones that have waited centuries for someone to speak the proper incantations, to offer the correct sacrifices, to provide the vessel through which ancient hungers can return to feed on the living world. But the monster that emerges from Stoker's imagination bears only passing resemblance to the man who once ruled Wallachia with stakes and terror, where Vlad Tepes was mortal, vulnerable, ultimately defeated by the same human frailties that destroy all princes who trust too much and forgive too little. Dracula becomes something that transcends human limitation, immortal, undying, eternally hungry for the one substance that connects all living things: blood. The transformation begins with geography. Stoker moves his vampire from the historical Wallachia to the more mysterious Transylvania, from the relatively familiar Danube plains to the Carpathian Mountains, where civilized maps end and older, stranger territories begin. This is not the Transylvania of census records and tax collectors, but a landscape of the imagination where wolves sing arias to the moon and peasants cross themselves when strangers ask directions to castles that appear on no official documents. In this mythic geography, Castle Dracula perches on precipices that exist more in nightmare than in any surveyor's chart, its towers reaching towards stars that shine with the cold light of eyes that have witnessed too much death to retain any warmth for the living. The building itself becomes character, antagonist, trap, a structure that exists not merely to shelter its inhabitant, but to facilitate his predations, to serve as both prison and palace for a creature that has learned to make eternity into a form of exquisite torture. But geography alone does not make a monster. The true transformation occurs in the realm of appetite, in the evolution of Vlad's historical cruelties into something that serves needs more fundamental than political control or military strategy. The historical Vlad impaled his enemies on stakes and watched them die over hours or days, their suffering serving practical purposes. Terror that discouraged rebellion, spectacle that reinforced authority, education that taught survivors to choose submission over defiance. His cruelties were terrible but finite, bounded by the limitations of mortal flesh, and the practical requirements of governing a principality caught between hostile empires. Stoker's Dracula transforms this finite cruelty into infinite hunger. Where Vlad killed to maintain power, Dracula feeds to sustain existence. Where the historical prince used death as a tool, the fictional vampire makes death into a sacrament, a communion that binds predator and prey in relationships that outlast the grave and extend beyond the boundaries of individual mortality. The blood that flows through Dracula's story carries meanings that transcend its literal function as sustenance for an undead predator. It becomes symbol, metaphor, obsession, representing everything from sexual desire to colonial anxiety, from aristocratic decadence to foreign contamination, from religious corruption to scientific materialism. Each reader finds different meanings in the vampire's bite, different fears reflected in his pale face, different anxieties embodied in his ability to cross boundaries that decent people believe should remain permanently sealed. Victorian England provides fertile soil for such fears. This is an age when scientific discovery makes the impossible seem merely improbable. when archaeological expeditions uncover evidence of civilizations that existed long before biblical chronology suggested the world began, when theories of evolution challenge comfortable assumptions about humanity's special place in creation's hierarchy. In this context, Dracula becomes more than monster. He becomes thesis, argument, demonstration of what happens when the old certainties crumble and new possibilities emerge from the ruins. He represents the return of the repressed, the resurrection of appetites that civilization claims to have conquered, the persistence of hungers that Christianity promised to transform into higher forms of spiritual satisfaction. But Stoker's genius lies not merely in creating a monster that embodies Victorian anxieties, but in connecting this modern monster to historical roots that give him weight, substance, credibility. The novel's early chapters ground Dracula's supernatural attributes in carefully researched historical details about the prince who served as his inspiration, creating a foundation of fact beneath the superstructure of fantasy. Jonathan Harker's research into his client's background reveals glimpses of the historical Vlad filtered through the lens of legend. A prince who fought the Turks with methods that made even his allies question his sanity. A ruler whose cruelties became so notorious that his name survived the fall of his dynasty and the conquest of his principality. But these historical details serve not to illuminate the past, but to authenticate the present, to provide rational explanations for supernatural phenomena that resist purely rational understanding. The vampire that emerges from this historical foundation carries forward not just Vlad's name and geographical origins, but essential aspects of his character transformed to serve the needs of Gothic horror rather than political terror. Dracula's aristocratic bearing reflects the historical prince's noble birth. His military expertise echoes Vlad's reputation as a strategist. His cruel intelligence mirrors the calculating mind that turned impalement into an art form. Most importantly, both figures share the fundamental characteristic that makes them more than mere villains. They are products of their circumstances, shaped by forces beyond their control, transformed into monsters, not through inherent evil, but through exposure to experiences that would destroy weaker souls and corrupt stronger ones. The historical Vlad became the Impaler through years of captivity, betrayal, and survival, in a world where mercy was weakness and compassion was suicide. Stoker's Dracula achieves his monstrous immortality through similar processes of corruption and transformation, though the details remain deliberately vague, sketched in shadows that suggest more than they reveal. This ambiguity serves the story's deeper purposes by making Dracula simultaneously specific and universal, historically grounded and mythically resonant. He is the Wallachian prince who learned cruelty from Turkish captors, but he is also every aristocrat whose privileges depend on the suffering of those beneath him. He is the medieval ruler who used terror as statecraft, but he is also every predator who disguises exploitation as protection, consumption as care. The novel's publication in 1897 releases Dracula into a world that has largely forgotten the historical Vlad, except as a footnote in the larger story of Ottoman expansion and Christian resistance. But Stoker's vampire rapidly achieves a cultural presence that the historical prince never possessed, spreading through popular consciousness with the efficiency of the plague he metaphorically represents. Stage adaptations multiply like infections, each one adding new details to the growing mythology. Film versions follow, transforming Stoker's literary creation into visual spectacle that reaches audiences who have never read the novel but recognize the character through images that burn themselves into collective memory. The pale face, the black cape, the gleaming fangs that promise transformation through violation. Each adaptation moves Dracula further from his historical origins, while paradoxically reinforcing his connection to the prince who inspired him. The vampire's Transylvanian castle echoes the historical Vlad's mountain fortresses. His aristocratic authority reflects the actual power wielded by medieval princes. His casual cruelty mirrors the methodical violence that made the Impaler a name that mothers used to frighten children into obedience. But the most significant transformation occurs in the realm of desire, where the historical Vlad inspired fear, hatred, and grudging respect. Dracula becomes an object of fascination that borders on attraction. The vampire's predation carries erotic undertones that make his victims complicit in their own destruction, willing participants in rituals that promise immortality at prices that seem almost reasonable when whispered in voices that sound like silk drawn across naked skin. This sexualization of Vlad's legacy represents perhaps the most radical departure from historical fact. The actual prince showed little interest in sensual pleasures, focusing his energies on political survival and military strategy. His cruelties served practical purposes rather than personal gratification. His violence was instrumental rather than expressive. Dracula transforms this instrumental violence into something far more intimate and infinitely more disturbing. His bite becomes kiss, his feeding becomes seduction, his killing becomes transformation. Where Vlad destroyed his enemies completely, Dracula creates them eternally, binding his victims to him through bonds that death cannot sever and time cannot weaken. The vampire's immortality serves as both gift and curse, offering escape from human limitation while trapping its recipients in forms of existence that make death seem like mercy. This paradox reflects deeper anxieties about progress, change, and the prices demanded by transformation. In an age when industrial revolution promises to remake human life in ways that earlier generations could never have imagined, Dracula embodies fears about what might be lost when old certainties give way to new possibilities. Yet the monster's appeal persists across generations precisely because he offers solutions to problems that purely human heroes cannot address. Dracula is never truly defeated, never permanently destroyed, never finally eliminated from the world he haunts. He returns in new forms, adapted to new fears, evolved to meet new needs that each generation discovers in its struggle to understand what it means to be human in a universe that seems increasingly indifferent to human values and human suffering. The historical Vlad died in 1476, probably in battle against Ottoman forces, definitely alone and forgotten by the allies who had used his services when convenient and abandoned him when support became politically expensive. His body was never found, his grave never properly marked, his dynasty extinguished by the same political forces that had elevated it to temporary prominence. But Stoker's Dracula achieves the immortality that the historical prince could never claim, living on through endless adaptations, interpretations, and reinventions that keep him perpetually present in popular consciousness. Each generation discovers new meanings in his story, new relevance in his hungers, new fears that his existence validates and explains. The transformation is complete. The man becomes myth, the prince becomes predator, the historical figure becomes archetype that transcends its original context and enters the realm of universal human experience. Vlad Tepes, who once ruled a small principality for a few years and died in obscurity, becomes Dracula, who rules the imagination of the world and will never die as long as human beings remain capable of being frightened by stories told in the darkness when rational defenses are weakest. The coffin opens, the monster emerges, and somewhere in the space between historical fact and fictional truth, between what actually happened and what should have happened, between the prince who was and the vampire who never was, but somehow is, Vlad Dracula achieves the only form of immortality that actually matters. The ability to make people remember, to make them afraid, to make them understand that some hungers are too ancient and too powerful to be satisfied by anything the modern world offers. The resurrection is complete. The man who became legend has become something greater and more terrible. The legend that has learned to live independently of the man who inspired it, feeding not on blood but on the inexhaustible human capacity for fear, growing stronger with each retelling, Each adaptation, each moment when someone whispers his name in the darkness and wonders if such things could possibly be true. They are true. Not historically, not factually, not in ways that would satisfy scholarly investigation or scientific inquiry, but in the deeper sense that matters more than mere evidence. They are true to human nature, true to human need, true to human recognition that the universe contains mysteries that reason cannot solve and hungers that civilization cannot satisfy. The vampire lives because the fear that created him never dies. And as long as human beings understand that some appetites transcend death and some forms of power operate beyond the reach of law or justice or simple human decency, Dracula will continue his feeding, his hunting, his eternal return to remind the living that death is not the end, but merely another form of transformation. The coffin stays open, the monster walks among us, and somewhere in the darkness, Count Dracula smiles with teeth that gleam like promises he has no intention of keeping, and whispers words that echo across centuries like prayers spoken in a language that only devils understand completely. The tour buses arrive each morning like pilgrims seeking absolution from sins they have never committed, carrying visitors who hunger for darkness in an age that has forgotten how to be properly afraid. They climb the winding road to Bran Castle through mountain air that tastes of snow and old secrets, their cameras ready to capture proof that monsters once walked the earth and might walk again if the proper conditions align and the ancient hungers wake from their restless slumber. The guides speak in voices trained to make legends sound like history, and history sound like bedtime stories designed to frighten children who no longer believe in anything more dangerous than overdue credit card payments. Here, they say, pointing to stones that have witnessed too much to retain any innocence. Count Dracula once held court. Here, Vlad the Impaler planned his reign of terror. Here, the line between man and monster blurred beyond recognition and gave birth to nightmares that still feed on the living world. But the tourists who shuffle through corridors where shadows pool like spilled wine are chasing phantoms built from Hollywood dreams and Gothic novels, pursuing a Dracula who never set foot in this castle, hunting a vampire who exists only in the spaces between what people know and what they fear. The real Vlad Tepes ruled from Târgoviste, not Bran, lived in palaces of wood and stone rather than Gothic fantasies, died a mortal death that left a corpse instead of creating an immortal predator. Yet the tourists come anyway, drawn by hungers that transcend historical accuracy and enter territories where truth matters less than the need to believe that somewhere, in some dark corner of the world, magic still operates according to rules older than reason and more powerful than scientific explanation. In the villages below the castle, elderly Romanians watch the buses with eyes that remember different stories, older truths, more complex relationships between the living and the dead. They speak of Tepes not as vampire or monster, but as something more dangerous and more necessary. A prince who understood that in the borderlands between empires, survival requires methods that make comfortable people in safe places reach for stronger wine when the evening prayers are finished. He was cruel, they say in voices weathered by decades of watching armies pass through fields they planted with grain and watered with tears. But he was cruel to those who deserved cruelty. The boyars who stole our grain fed crows instead of themselves. The Turks who burned our villages became fertilizer for fields they would never harvest again. This is the other Vlad, the one tourists never meet because he doesn't fit comfortably into the narratives that sell tickets and generate revenue for guides who have learned to transform history into entertainment. He is the prince of peasant memory, the ruler who protected the weak by destroying the strong, who used terror as a tool of justice rather than an expression of personal pathology. But even this folk memory carries contradictions that resist easy interpretation. The same villagers who praise Vlad's protection of peasant rights also cross themselves when his name is spoken after dark. The The same voices that celebrate his victories against Turkish invasion also whisper warnings about what happens when the dead refuse to stay properly buried. In the capitals where policies are made and national identities are forged through careful manipulation of historical narrative, Vlad Tepes serves purposes that would have amused and appalled the original prince. Romanian politicians invoke his name when they need to remind voters that their nation has always produced leaders who refuse to bow to foreign pressure, who choose death over dishonor, who understand that independence requires the willingness to pay prices that other nations find unacceptable. During the communist years, when Nicolae Ceausescu ruled Romania with methods that made his subjects study the Middle Ages for examples of comparable tyranny, Vlad became a symbol of nationalist resistance sanitized for official consumption. The state publishing houses produced biographies that transformed the Impaler into a patriotic hero who fought against foreign domination, a medieval precursor to modern Romanian socialism, a prince whose cruelties could be forgiven because they served the greater good of national independence. The propaganda worked so well that it survived the fall of communism and continues to influence Romanian self-perception decades after Ceausescu himself became food for the worms that care nothing for political ideology. In post-1989 Romania, Vlad's image appears on currency, postage stamps, tourist brochures, and political posters, always as defender of Romanian sovereignty, never as the international terrorist who made neighboring kingdoms sleep poorly and dream badly. But this sanitized patriotic version exists alongside darker currents that flow through Romanian consciousness, like underground rivers that surface only when conditions are right and the proper pressures are applied. In rural areas where old women still leave bread at crossroads to appease spirits that predate Christianity by centuries, Vlad exists not as historical figure, but as something more primal. The embodiment of the principle that some hungers are too ancient and too powerful to be satisfied by anything the modern world offers. These folk traditions speak of Vlad not as vampire in the Hollywood sense, but as something that combines mortal prince with supernatural predator, a ruler who learned to feed on fear itself and achieved a form of immortality that transcends physical death. He becomes the shadow that falls across Romanian consciousness when times are hard and enemies gather at the borders, the reminder that their ancestors survived by producing leaders who were willing to become monsters if monstrosity was the price of survival. The archaeological expeditions that periodically descend upon sites associated with Vlad's reign carry their own obsessions and their own agendas. They dig through layers of earth that remember screams, sift through debris that once witnessed impalements, search for evidence that might finally answer questions about where the historical prince ends and the legendary monster begins. Recent excavations at Târgoviște have uncovered foundations that might have supported the palace where Vlad held court, artifacts that might have belonged to nobles who died on his stakes, bones that might have been gnawed by rats that grew fat on the flesh of impaled Turkish prisoners. But archaeology, like history, offers only fragments, pieces of puzzles that resist completion, because the most important elements have been destroyed by time, politics, and the human tendency to forget details that make comfortable sleep impossible. DNA analysis of remains found in Italian monasteries claims to trace lineages that might connect to Vlad's bloodline, genetic evidence that suggests the Impaler's family survived his death and continued reproducing in exile. But genes, like legends, carry forward only what serves the purposes of those who inherit them, and the descendants of monsters sometimes become saints, while the children of saints occasionally discover appetites that would have horrified their ancestors. The internet age has democratized Vlad's legend, allowing anyone with a computer and an imagination to contribute to the growing mythology that surrounds his name. Websites proliferate like digital stakes, each one topped with theories about what Vlad really was, what he really did, what his survival might mean for a world that has forgotten how to be properly terrified. Some sites treat him as a historical figure deserving scholarly analysis, collecting documents and artifacts and witness testimonies in attempts to separate fact from fiction, to determine what actually happened in those mountain fortresses, where screams echoed off stone walls and blood pooled in courtyards that remember more than their current owners find comfortable. Others embrace the vampire mythology completely, treating Stoker's creation as if it were biographical truth, spinning elaborate theories about how an undead Vlad might have influenced historical events from the shadows, how his immortal hunger might continue to shape world events through methods too subtle for ordinary perception to detect. Still others occupy middle ground, suggesting that Vlad became something that transcends normal categories of living and dead, natural and supernatural, historical and mythical. In their interpretation, he achieved a form of existence that allows him to influence the world, not through physical presence, but through the power of stories themselves, the ability of certain narratives to shape human behavior in ways that mere facts never could. The occult communities that gather in shadowy corners of the internet speak of Vlad with voices that carry the hushed tones usually reserved for religious discussions, or confessions of crimes that cannot be forgotten but must never be reported to authorities who would not understand the complexities involved. They debate whether his methods might be replicated, whether his power might be channeled, whether his example might provide guidance for those who find themselves trapped in situations where conventional solutions have proven inadequate. These discussions occur in forums protected by layers of encryption and anonymity, conducted by people who may or may not believe what they are writing, but who understand that some ideas are too dangerous to express openly in societies that have forgotten the difference between civilization and mere order, between justice and simple law enforcement. Meanwhile, in university lecture halls where fluorescent lights buzz like dying insects and students take notes on laptops that glow like modern prayer candles, scholars continue debating questions that have occupied historians for centuries. Was Vlad monster or hero? Was his cruelty justified by circumstances or excessive by any reasonable standard? Did his methods serve legitimate purposes or express pathological needs that found convenient rationalization in political necessity? The debates continue because they reflect deeper questions about the nature of leadership, the relationship between power and morality, the prices that must sometimes be paid to preserve civilization from forces that recognize no limits and respect no boundaries. In an age when democratic societies struggle with authoritarian challenges, when liberal institutions face pressures from movements that promise simple solutions to complex problems, Vlad's example offers disturbing insights into what happens when leaders decide that normal rules no longer apply to abnormal situations. The academic conferences that convene annually in cities across Europe and America include panels dedicated to the Dracula phenomenon, medieval violence and modern memory, and nationalism and historical myth-making. The papers presented at these gatherings carry titles that would have amused the historical Vlad: Impalement as Political Theatre, The Semiotics of State Violence in 15th Century Wallachia, and Blood Libel and Bloodlust, Anti-Semitic and Orientalist Discourse in Dracula Studies. But beneath the academic jargon, the same fundamental questions persist. What makes a monster? When does necessary violence become inexcusable cruelty? How should contemporary societies remember leaders whose methods appall modern sensibilities, but whose results served purposes that even critics find difficult to dismiss completely? The questions matter because they are not merely historical. In a world where terrorism, ethnic cleansing, and systematic oppression continue to generate headlines that sound like dispatches from medieval battlefields, Vlad's example provides disturbing insights into how ordinary people can be transformed into instruments of extraordinary violence when circumstances align in ways that make extremism seem reasonable and moderation appear suicidal. The memorial plaques that mark sites associated with Vlad's reign carry inscriptions in multiple languages, acknowledging the international interest in a prince whose influence has spread far beyond the borders of the principality he once ruled through methods that made neighboring kingdoms reconsider their assumptions about the relationship between civilization and survival. But the plaques also reflect the continuing division in how different cultures interpret his legacy. Romanian inscriptions emphasize his role as defender of national independence, his success in protecting Orthodox Christianity from Islamic conquest, his contributions to the development of centralized government that could resist foreign domination. German plaques focus on his violations of diplomatic immunity, his excesses against Saxon merchants, his transformation of legitimate punishment into sadistic entertainment. Hungarian memorials acknowledge his complex relationship with their kingdom, his service as both ally and enemy, his embodiment of the principle that borderland princes must sometimes choose between different forms of loyalty, and that survival often requires betraying someone who trusted you. Turkish plaques, where they exist at all, treat him as a worthy adversary who fought with honor even when his methods violated conventional rules of warfare. The tourists who read these competing interpretations come away with the understanding that history, like wine, tastes different depending on who controls the vintage and what purposes it serves in the broader feast of cultural memory. But they also leave with questions that resist easy answers, uncertainties that make comfortable assumptions about good and evil. Civilization and barbarism seem suddenly inadequate to the complexities of human experience. As night falls across the Carpathian Mountains and shadows pool in valleys where wolves still sing to the moon, the buses carry their cargo of pilgrims back to hotels that offer modern amenities and cable television and room service. Back to a world where monsters exist only in stories and heroes always triumph over evil through methods that leave their consciences clean and their hands unstained by compromise. But some of the pilgrims will dream of stakes and castles, of princes who chose damnation over defeat, of rulers who understood that some prices must be paid, even when the cost exceeds anything that accountants trained in conventional bookkeeping know how to calculate. They will wake with the taste of old blood in their mouths and the sound of distant screams echoing in their ears, and for a moment they will understand that the line between civilization and chaos is thinner than they had previously imagined. The legend lives because the need for such legends never dies. In every generation, in every culture, in every historical moment, when the comfortable certainties that make normal life possible begin to crack under pressures that exceed their design limitations, someone remembers the prince who chose to become a monster rather than allow his people to become victims. And in that remembering, in that moment when modern people recognize their kinship with medieval fears, Vlad Tepes achieves the only form of immortality that actually matters. The ability to remind the living that survival sometimes requires transformations that decent people prefer not to contemplate, but that desperate people must embrace or perish. The grave remains open. The questions remain unanswered, and somewhere in the space between historical fact and mythic truth, between what actually happened and what might happen again if the proper conditions align, Vlad Dracula continues his eternal watch over a world that has forgotten how to distinguish between civilization and mere comfort, between justice and simple law enforcement, between the kinds of leaders who preserve societies and the kinds of princes who sometimes must destroy them in order to save them. The tour buses will return tomorrow, carrying new pilgrims in search of old fears, bringing fresh questions to places where ancient answers echo in the wind that moves through mountain passes like the breath of something that has learned patience but has never learned mercy. And in the villages below the castle, the old women will continue to cross themselves when certain names are spoken after dark, understanding truths that tourists will never learn and scholars will never fully accept. Some hungers are too old and too deep to be satisfied by anything the modern world offers. Some legends are too powerful and too necessary to be confined by historical accuracy or contemporary moral comfort. Some princes, once awakened, never truly sleep again. The story ends, but the telling continues. The man dies, but the myth endures. And somewhere in the darkness that gathers at the edges of every civilization that believes itself permanent, Vlad Tepes waits for his next summoning, his next resurrection, his next opportunity to teach lessons that no one wants to learn, but that everyone, eventually, must understand. The Impaler's work is never finished. The stakes are always ready, and the forest of the damned continues to grow, one story at a time, one fear at a time, one soul at a time, until the harvest is complete, and the last lesson is finally learned by students who understand, too late, that some educations are too expensive to survive, but too necessary to avoid. The dragon's son is dead. Long live the dragon's son, forever and ever, world without end, until the last stake rots, and the last story is forgotten, and the last tourist stops coming to ask questions about the difference between monsters and men.